Welcome to This Week in Creationism, episode number 10. My name is Joel Duff, and I'm your host as we look at the headlines from creationist websites over the past week. This week we have apes according to Answers in Genesis and Institute for Creation Research, beating the junk DNA horse, and what is baraminology? Let's go right to the Answers in Genesis website where they have an article, Lucy, Human Ancestor or Ape Skeleton. It's actually not a new article. It's an article from 2017, which they are re-highlighting on their website. But it does give me an opportunity to talk about this particular display that's at the Creation Museum that talks about their particular viewpoint of how the apes are related to humans, but more so, I'm interested in how they understand how apes are related to other apes. And you can see it in this particular figure, although I'm going to let me highlight a little bit bigger. They have at the Creation Museum, there's a new exhibit there, or at least new in the last 2 years, an exhibit there. Who are Lucy's relatives? So this article is about Lucy in particular, but they have, like I said, like I just said, they have a display that talks about who are all her relatives. By saying relatives, that means who is she related to? If not to man, is she related to anything else? And their conclusion is she is actually related by common ancestry to a bunch of other different species of apes. And this particular figure, which is again displayed at the Creation Museum, gives their particular view of, I'll call it speciation and the origin of species. This is something we've talked about many times, and I will talk about in a few moments when we talk about baraminology, but I think this one's particularly instructive. So we have over here creation, right? On the sixth day of creation, they have the original great apes, right? The original great apes, I don't know why they're shown as these four-legged walking things that kind of look like they're a cat, but without a tail. But then they suggest that the original great apes after um, Adam's sin uh, began to diversify, and they show all these different lineages into a bunch of different discernible lineages of apes, right? And these are in dashed lines because this is hypothetical that before the flood, apes diversified into a variety of different apes. But of course, the Great Flood was the great divider, in terms of world history, and Noah preserved two of each kind. And what they're saying is, and this is the big picture here, they're saying that all the great apes are a single kind of organism. So therefore, God created one kind of ape, and therefore, on Noah's Ark, only two of this kind needed to be there. They are the survivors of the global flood, this catastrophe. All these other lineages would have been killed. Now, there's absolutely no fossil record at all for Answers in Genesis of any apes that were preserved in this particular flood. So this again is completely hypothetical in terms of before the line. And then we see what they suggest is that those two apes then diversified. So as they had descendants, those descendants became became more different from one another, right? And they then evolved into a variety of different lineages we'd recognize today. Well, at least these we'd recognize, right? The orangutans, the gorillas, and then the chimps and bonobos. And chimps and bonobos are different species, but they're very similar to each other. These dark lines represent the fossil record. So this is the observed fossil record that everybody agrees that yes, there are fossils of gorillas, there are fossils of chimps, and there are fossils of orangutans. And there's also fossils of extinct lineages of other related organisms, including the Australopithecus. I can't say that word. The Australopiths, I'll just say as a general group, and the Artiopiths and so forth. And those are represented by these skulls down here. And what they're indicating is that they believe that these are all related by common ancestry. If you travel back, you'll find find their common ancestor in these two individuals that were on Noah's Ark. But they don't survive to today, right? They went extinct before that time. Right. So what they're saying is all the great apes, all the diversity, they're saying an orangutan and a gorilla and a chimp are all related to each other by common ancestry, but not related to man, right? They're going to have the origin of man here. Man survives the flood. man stays the same all the way to the Ice Age and into the present particular age without diversifying into different species. Although there are lineages that, like Neanderthals, that come around sometime after the global flood. Now, interestingly, Institute for Creation Research is coming out with a new book. Specifically, Jeffrey Tompkins is coming out with a new book, Chimps and Humans. A geneticist discovers DNA evidence that challenges evolution. And I'm pretty sure this is just going to be a compilation of a lot of his papers in which he does this DNA analysis, which I've written about before. Many other people have. The bottom line is he finds there to be more genetic difference between humans and chimps than is usually recognized. But he uses a different measure for a measuring stick for making that measurement. And the one thing I have called on Tompkins to do, and others have called on him to do, is to use that same measuring stick to do something like, what's the difference between a chimpanzee and a bonobo? How much difference is there? Using his particular special way of measuring the genetic distance between two different species. Or what's the difference between a gorilla and an orangutan? And I know what the result's going to be if it uses his particular type of analysis. He's going to find out that they're more different from each other than a chimpanzee is from a human. And so, again, I think that's another reason why, combined with their view of where the flood happens and the problem they have with fossils of chimps before the flood and after the flood, suggesting they're a continuous lineage, that's why I think that ultimately Tompkins and others in the Institute for Creation Research are going to go with a model of kinds that has multiple different kinds of great apes being in the original creation, because they're going to have a genetic model which suggests they're as different from each other as humans are from chimps, and therefore it's only logical in an apples to apples comparison that they should be separated. And they'll have their geological model and the fossil model that also fits that. This again is going to set up a fairly significant and obvious difference between these two apologetics organizations in terms of their approach to the various and how to define kinds of organisms. All right, quick look at a few other things going on in Answers in Genesis. Here is another article from the day before, Genesis or Revelation. Which one's more important? Spoiler alert, they're going to say that Genesis is a lot more important, right? That it's the foundational book of the Bible for a Christian worldview. What they're really upset, or what Ken Ham is really, his point here is that, lots of Christians get wrapped up in eschatology. In other words, views of the end time, and they get into Revelation, and as if like looking forward to the future is far more important than understanding the past or the foundation of where Christianity comes from. I don't necessarily disagree with Answers in Genesis here, that Genesis is a more revelatory book in terms of establishing the foundations of Christian principles and the nature of humanity and God than Revelation is. Not that all the books of the Bible don't have importance, but Genesis it's kind of it's a silly question in a way, but I think that they only raise it because they see so many Christians wrapped up, as I said before, in eschatology, and it's sort of like all they think about. And there's so many debates about the interpretation of Revelation, and Revelation is a much more difficult book to interpret than the book of Genesis is. Um, Even though Answers in Genesis doesn't do a very good job of interpreting Genesis, um, they probably have a better handle on Genesis than they do Revelation in this particular case. And then here's another highlight from the day before, an article on John Dewey, atheist architect of public education. And I only just show this to you to show you that there's a regular cycle, or there's a regular pattern of the culture war sort of articles. How is evolution, how is atheism affecting everything around us, and why we should be skeptical of all these different human institutions, and especially since this has to do with public education. So anytime we can dismiss or diss on public education, all the better. driving people to homeschooling and so forth, which is a big message of Answers in Genesis and Ken Ham in particular. And then we come to, an article that kind of, I'm so tired of hearing about junk DNA. And so they have this article, junk DNA, its days are over, question mark. And we see if we go to Ken Ham's blog portion of the Answers in Genesis website, we have the days of junk DNA are over. And in the article, which I'm not going to show you all the components of the article, but in the article, it talks about in a recent article, and it has a link to a recent article talking about these particular parasitic worms. And what's interesting about that link to the recent article is you think that the recent article they're going to link to is the actual scientific article that discusses these parasitic worms and the supposed junk DNA that has now been found to have purpose to it or function to it. But when you click on that link, what you end up doing is going to this particular website here, Evolution News, and I haven't mentioned it on my Creation in the News segment yet, but Evolution News is sponsored by the Discovery Institute, so it's an intelligent design site, and it isn't really evolution news so much as it's about evolution, but it's about what's wrong with evolution. This particular article is written by Casey Luskin, who is writing about a really sophisticated genetics, evolutionary biology article, which I'm going to show in a moment. But I just want to point out that Casey Luskin is a geologist, a PhD geologist that's an attorney, and writes a ton of stuff for Evolution News and basically what he's interpreting the world of secular science through the eyes of this Discovery Institute intelligent design framework. And I mean, Casey might know a lot of things about a lot of things, but I'm certainly not terribly impressed with his knowledge of biology. And this is more of the reason I'm upset about this article is it's really just more of a cherry picking quotes to make it sound like, oh, the nails in the coffin over junk DNA. I'm just kind of tired of the use of the word junk DNA. I've been teaching biology in various forms for 20 years, and I do use the term junk DNA sometimes, but in specific contexts. And I'm very careful to define what we're trying to communicate with the idea of junk DNA, which includes things like repetitive elements or portions of non-coding sequence that are maybe unique sequence but don't appear to have any particular functional role. Despite what the Discovery Institute says and others and Ken Ham, there are portions of the genome that don't have any, I'll say, important function, because you could argue that every piece of the DNA has some function. I mean, after all, even a piece of DNA between two genes is holding those genes apart at some interval, and the way the DNA is wrapped around the histones of the proteins of your chromosomes can form a form of function just in terms of its positioning of other pieces of DNA. But that's different than saying that particular piece of DNA is a piece of code. All right, that the code itself is important because it makes some particular product. Now, what happened in this particular article that's being referred? Oh, let me go back just a second. Ken Ham, writes this blog post, and actually he didn't write it; it's written by others for him. They link to not the actual research, which is kind of understandable. I mean, to link his audience to this particular paper, satellite-like W elements, repetitive, transcribed, and putative and mobile genetic elements with potential roles for biology and the evolution of Schistosoma mansoni or mansoni. Not exactly, an afternoon read. With a cup of coffee or something like that for enjoyment, right? This is a pretty dense article. So what he does is he links to an article in which you have somebody who's not an expert in this field who is going to pick out one little element of this paper and then write about how this paper is helping to show that junk DNA is dead. And I'm sure Ken Ham and no one that wrote his article actually looked at the original article and asked, did that particular author understand what he was talking about? And they take it to another level in terms of exaggerating the importance of this particular paper for undermining the concept of junk DNA. So it's kind of like it's like when you have you have misinformation and then you build on that misinformation by referring to misinformation, and then you double up on the misinformation by interpreting that misinformation wrong. But if we go back to the original article, and this isn't the place to do this in terms of the details of it. Yes, these authors actually do use a quote about it. It's time to put the nail in the coffin of junk DNA. And I was like, well, yeah, duh. I mean, that's been true for a long time, that we know that repetitive elements, mobile genetic factors, and so forth, pieces of DNA that can jump around in the genome, and even pieces of DNA that appear to be that aren't part of the coding sequence or um, what we call regulatory elements up front, can find functions, through mutations and become useful to a genome over time. And we also know that many pieces of DNA that don't actually use for any particular downstream function do get transcribed by the genome, which looks like function, except that it isn't. All right, so I'm saying a whole bunch of stuff to try to say that there are different levels of function, and functionality, just showing that repetitive elements have function, that's been shown many, many, many times. And these particular authors were actually making the point that we're showing it for the first time in this particular organism. Not that they were showing the first time ever. So it wasn't as novel as the Casey Luskin makes it sound, and then Ken Ham amplifies that. Um, I found this paper to be quite interesting. It's very interesting because it involves repetitive portions of DNA, which usually have just a function in terms of how the DNA is organized on a chromosome, which is an important function, but it's different than determining a characteristic. In this case, the characteristic is sex, all right? Whether it's a female or male in this weird ZZZW thing, not XX and XY. They have a different chromosome pattern that has to do with these repetitive elements. And get this, one of the reasons I also found this paper interesting is because I have worked with a colleague who works on another small crustacean that has a ZZZW sex system. Actually, it's even more complicated than that, because it has 3 different kinds of sexes, because it has hermaphrodites as well and different chromosomes for all this stuff. And in that particular system, we have a couple of students here who I'm working with them on their projects, where they're looking for repetitive elements specifically as markers of the development of a sex chromosome, and how those particular repetitive elements might actually cause the development of separate sex chromosomes. All right, that's the same thing that's happening in this paper. All right, so this wasn't exactly shocking to me, all right, and it really shouldn't have been shocking or surprising to them. And they talk about how only these couple of repetitive elements of a whole family of repetitive elements actually has this particular function, whereas most of them are random insertions which have yet defined function, meaning they're there, pieces of DNA in the genome, and maybe someday they'll find some function. All right, evolutionary mechanisms through mutations could potentially find functions for them in the future, but they don't have function right now. So they're admitting that there's junk DNA in the genome, even though this article is being used as evidence that we no longer can talk about junk DNA, that there aren't useless pieces of DNA in a genome. Well, they're useless now, but future function means they actually have a function. They're providing the template or portions of code that could become potentially useful in the future, in which case that is a function. So if you want to get really nitpicky about your definition of function, I'll agree that every portion of the genome has function, or at least potential function. And that's just not, but that's not as revelatory or new, and that doesn't upturn all of evolutionary biology or anything like that. It's just sort of a natural outcome of understanding the mechanisms of molecular evolutionary processes. That's junk DNA, and again, like I said, it young Earth creationists love to talk about junk DNA because it's one of these stories where it's like, oh, scientists used to say this thing wasn't useful, and now they say it's useful. See, they were wrong. They thought one thing, and now we think another. And so then the next jump of the logic it always is in every article, including this little very short blog post by Ken Ham. The next logical step for them is to say, well, if you were wrong about that, well, you might be wrong about everything else. And I would say, sure, evolutionary biologists overstepped in terms of not understanding what the function of some portions of the DNA were, but they also figured out what the functions of them were. And it hasn't really overturned anything. And I would, like I said before, to me, it's not all that surprising. Let's see, what else do we got here? Let's go over to the New Creation blog, sponsored by Is Genesis History. There is a fantastic article there. Highly recommend this one. What is Baraminology by Christian Ryan? Christian Ryan is a young creationist, up and coming creationist writer um, who takes a bunch of stuff and synthesizes it and just has a wonderful way of putting it together. Love, I love his perspectives and his willingness to get into some very challenging questions and sort of lay out what is the creationist position here, what are some of the advantages of the creationist position in his mind, and he's reflecting the creationist literature in this case. But then also to say, what are the challenges for creationists? And I think he does a great job of sort of illustrating what are some of the challenges, what are the things that, for him, there are challenges to be overcome. I think in many cases they're really huge challenges, which I don't think can be overcome by creationists. But nonetheless, for him, they're identifying the the things that are the potential stumbling blocks that we have to find explanations for. And he does a great job of pulling together and answering this question, what is baraminology? And baraminology is the study of created kind, something that I talk about all the time. And I got to tell you, this is going to be my go-to reference with respect to when somebody asks me, what is baraminology? I'm going to say, you could read this creationist article and have a pretty decent idea of what is baraminology, what is in what is involved in the study of created kinds? What are the questions that are going to come up in when you talk about the study of created kinds? And what are the challenges of figuring out what a created kind is? In other words, what kinds of organisms did God originally create? It's really a question of how much evolution are you going to allow in the system, right? If take answers in Genesis, which we just talked about. If apes are all one kind, then that's a lot of evolution that has occurred, right? That's a diversification of two individuals all the way into chimpanzees and orangutans. That's a huge amount of diversity that has been created or formed over a very short period of time. And then, so what is the boundary? How far can they go? How much can they change? What has God given them to be able to change, and what are the mechanisms of those changes? All right, I'm going into far too much detail here because I get all excited about this topic. Here's what I'll say about this particular paper. If you want to know what baraminology is, this is a great place to start. And I'm going to make a separate video in which I'm just going to go through and I'm going to read this article and I'm going to talk about what he's talking about. All right, and why I think he's making some important points. And then I'm going to add to some of the challenges. But I think actually talking through his article is a great way to kind of get an idea of creationist biology and their understanding of the history of life on Earth. That's what this article summarizes. So if you're interested in baraminology, go check that out. One last thing before we leave this week in creationism. This is not on a creationist website, but I'll say it's not on there yet. So I like to anticipate what I think young Earth creationists are going to talk about in the next week or two. This is an article from Scientific Reports, Nature Scientific Reports. Earliest evidence of herd living and age segregation among dinosaurs. And the thing that doesn't sound very exciting, but it really is about a fossil site down in Patagonia in South America. Fantastic fossil site, which includes nests, dinosaur nests. But what's more important about this one is there's evidence of groups of individual dinosaurs that were all preserved at one time. So a mass death of a group of dinosaurs. In one case, one of those groups was all dinosaurs probably less than the age of 2. And this paper includes the evidence for how they know that they're less than 2 years old. It has to do with the bone histology. And then there was groups of eggs, right, and youngsters, 1 year old, and then there are adults in other areas, and that's the age segregation part. The idea that there's a herd, a large grouping of dinosaurs living in that area, and they are living in such a way that there are nests over here, there are young adults over here, and then there are adults in other places, and they're living in a herd-like situation. They're not all individuals. And this is some of the oldest evidence, meaning they're the oldest fossils that represent this type of behavior among dinosaurs. Now, why would young Earth creationists talk about this? I think they're going to have to feel like they need to dismiss this article or just say that, well, that's wonderful. I mean, dinosaurs are found, but look at all these fossils. There were so many of them, and they were found in sometimes in what looks like kind of mass graves, like a whole bunch of 2-year-old. I think that's what they're going to pick up on is the group of 2-year-old dinosaurs that were all preserved together. And they're going to say, well, how could that have possibly happened? It must have been a global flood. But I'm going to come back and say, and I'm going to show the figure, and I'll probably, as soon as they talk about it, this is, I'm warning them, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to show the figures from this paper. I'm not going to show them now, but I'm going to show them later because there is some seriously challenging geology and paleontological evidence in this particular paper that I think any creationist who really thinks hard about what the evidence is there, what the observational evidence is from this particular site, will realize it is completely incompatible with any young Earth creationist description of a global flood. And so I anticipate being able to talk about this paper more in the future. All right, so that's what we've got for this week in creationism. Again, if you enjoyed this content at all or want to find out about those dinosaur nests and interesting dinosaur fossils in the next week or two, better hit that subscribe button and then you won't miss out on it. All right, again, my name's Joel Duff, and thank you for being with me this time.